Poor Paralyzed Girl only had $3 for her birthday cake, until a Mafia Boss walked over and $3. That's all Abigail had for her birthday cake. The coin sat pathetically on her palm as she wheeled herself into Wilson's bakery, the winter chill following her through the door. Her 24th birthday, spent alone in a wheelchair that had become both prison and identity. 3 years had passed since the accident that severed her spinal cord, stealing not just her ability to walk, but her promising career as a physical therapist. The irony wasn't lost on her. Now she needed the very therapy she'd once provided. The small apartment she called home was as cold and empty as her birthday would be. Mrs. Wilson's face fell when Abigail placed her meager coins on the counter. "What can I get for this?" she asked, hating the crack in her voice. The kindly baker glanced at the small display of cupcakes, clearly calculating what might be possible with such a small sum. The bell above the door jingled, bringing with it a blast of frigid air and the commanding presence of a man who seemed to fill the entire shop. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit despite the snow, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. A small girl clutching his hand stared openly at Abigail's wheelchair. "Daddy, why is that lady in a chair with wheels?" the child asked loudly. Abigail felt her cheeks burn as she tried to sink deeper into her chair, wishing the floor would swallow her whole. The man looked at her with dark, assessing eyes that seemed to strip away every defense. What happened next would haunt Abigail's memories for years to come. The man stepped forward, his gaze never leaving her face, something like recognition flickering in his eyes. "Give the lady whatever she wants," he told Mrs. Wilson, placing a $100 bill on the counter with a finality that brooked no argument. Abigail's pride flared hot and immediate. "I don't need charity," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. The little girl tilted her head, studying Abigail with innocent curiosity, while her father's expression remained unreadable, dangerous in its intensity. "It's not charity," he replied, his voice surprisingly soft for a man of his stature. "Consider it my daughter's birthday gift to you." The little girl's face lit up at this explanation, and she nodded enthusiastically, her curls bouncing with the movement. "My name is Mia," the child announced proudly. "I'm 6 3/4. Do you like chocolate cake? Daddy says everyone should have cake on their birthday." Her father's hand came to rest protectively on her shoulder, but his eyes remained fixed on Abigail. Mrs. Wilson stood frozen, clearly sensing the tension crackling between them. The $100 bill remained on the counter, a bridge or a barrier between Abigail's pride and the stranger's insistence. Outside, the snow fell harder, coating Boston in a blanket of white silence. In the end, it was the child's hopeful face that broke Abigail's resolve. "I'm Abigail," she said finally. "And yes, I like chocolate cake." Mrs. Wilson exhaled with relief, reaching for her best display cake as the little girl clapped her hands in delight. The man finally introduced himself, extending a hand that bore the small scar of an old knife wound across the knuckles. "Frank Carson," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from somewhere darker than mere confidence. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Abigail." Mrs. Wilson returned with a beautiful chocolate cake, complete with fresh strawberries and elegant decorations. "Your change, Mr. Carson," she offered, but he waved it away. Something in his gesture suggested this wasn't generosity but calculation. As Mrs. Wilson boxed the cake, Frank leaned down slightly. "I never forget a face," he murmured, too low for others to hear, "especially not one that saved my daughter's life." Abigail's blood ran cold as memories flooded back. A hospital corridor, a choking child, a desperate CPR session 3 years ago. The coincidence seemed impossible, yet there they stood, the paralyzed physical therapist who had once saved a stranger's child, and the man who now commanded enough power in Boston's underworld to make people disappear with a single phone call. Neither could have predicted how their lives would entangle from this moment forward. Frank Carson hadn't always been a name that made hardened men flinch. 20 years ago, he was just another hungry kid from South Boston, with nothing but ambition and a talent for calculating odds. His rise through the ranks had been as brutal as it was methodical. The Carson Syndicate now controlled most of Boston's waterfront, a business built on protection rackets that had evolved into legitimate enterprises, shipping, real estate, and restaurants that served as perfect fronts. Frank had learned long ago that true power lay in the balance between fear and respect. After losing his wife to cancer 4 years earlier, Mia had become his world, the only person who saw the man beneath the carefully constructed facade. She had nearly died from an allergic reaction during a routine hospital visit, saved only by a quick-thinking therapist who happened to be passing by. Frank had searched for that therapist afterward, wanting to express his gratitude, but she had disappeared. Hospital records mentioned an accident, but nothing more. Until today, when he walked into Wilson's bakery and saw her face, older, sadder, but unmistakable. While Mia chatted animatedly with Abigail about birthday traditions, Frank made a call. His most trusted lieutenant answered on the first ring. "I need everything you can find on Abigail." He paused, realizing he didn't know her last name. A physical therapist, wheelchair-bound. Accident 3 years ago. Within 20 minutes, his phone buzzed with a text. Abigail Porter, 27, former physical therapist at Boston Memorial. Car accident 3 years ago left her paralyzed from the waist down. Insurance settlement depleted by medical bills. Currently unemployed, living on disability and subsidized housing. Frank watched as Mia insisted on helping Abigail cut her birthday cake right there in the bakery, Mrs. Wilson providing plates and forks with nervous efficiency. The older woman clearly recognized Frank, her hands trembling slightly as she served them. The Carson family had protected this neighborhood for years, their methods not always gentle but effective. Businesses like Wilson's Bakery paid their monthly dues and enjoyed freedom from the random violence that plagued other districts. What Frank couldn't explain, even to himself, was the strange pull he felt toward Abigail. Perhaps it was the debt he still carried for his daughter's life, or maybe it was the defiance in Abigail's eyes, something rare in those who knew who he was. "Daddy says we should always celebrate properly," Mia was telling Abigail, chocolate frosting smeared across her cheek. "He says moments matter more than things." Frank's expression softened watching his daughter, the only person who knew the man he might have been. Abigail's smile didn't quite reach her eyes as she glanced from father to daughter. "Your daddy sounds very wise," she said carefully. Frank recognized the cautious assessment in her gaze. She was trying to reconcile the man before her with the dark whispers about Carson that floated through the city. She didn't yet realize that his appearance in her life wasn't coincidence, but destiny reasserting itself. Frank believed in debts, paying them and collecting them with equal fervor. The debt he owed Abigail Porter would be repaid, whether she wanted it or not. Mia's innocent chatter filled the awkward silence as they shared the impromptu birthday celebration. "Do you have any birthday wishes?" she asked Abigail. "Daddy says they only come true if you believe hard enough." Frank watched as something vulnerable flickered across Abigail's face. "I used to wish for different things," Abigail answered quietly, her hands resting on the wheels of her chair. "Now, I just wish for enough." The simplicity of her statement hit Frank harder than he expected, reminding him of his own hungry years before power and money insulated him. As they finished the cake, Frank made a decision. "Mia and I are having a small dinner party tonight," he said, the lie coming easily. "We'd be honored if you'd join us." Abigail's surprise was evident, her fork pausing midway to her mouth. "I couldn't possibly," she began, but Mia was already bouncing with excitement. "Please come. We have a piano and Daddy makes the best pasta ever." Frank watched the internal struggle play across Abigail's face, pride warring with loneliness. The mention of a piano caught Abigail's attention. "You play?" Frank asked, noting the way her fingers twitched slightly. "I used to," she admitted, the words carrying the weight of everything she'd lost. Before the accident. Outside, the snow had intensified, transforming Boston into a postcard scene. Frank gestured toward the window. "You shouldn't wheel yourself home in this weather. Let me give you a ride at least." He could see she was calculating her options, each one limited. "My driver can take you home now if you prefer," Frank offered, providing an escape route he hoped she wouldn't take. "Or to our home for dinner. Your choice." He was unaccustomed to giving choices. In his world, he commanded, and others obeyed. Mrs. Wilson busied herself cleaning nearby tables, pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. The neighborhood would be buzzing by morning with news that Frank Carson had taken a personal interest in the girl in the wheelchair. "Please come," Mia pleaded, her small hand resting on Abigail's arm. "It's your birthday." There was something in the child's innocent insistence that seemed to crumble Abigail's last defense. Frank watched the moment her resolve weakened. "I should warn you," Abigail said finally. "I'm not very good company these days." Her attempt at humor fell flat, highlighting the isolation that had clearly become her daily reality. Frank understood isolation better than most. His position demanded it. Mia, with a child's perfect timing, said, "That's okay. Daddy isn't good company either. He frowns too much and scares people." The unexpected honesty startled a genuine laugh from Abigail, the sound transforming her face completely. Frank's phone buzzed again. Glancing down, he saw a message from his lieutenant. "Ravelli crew moving on South Dock tonight. Need instructions. Business intruding, as always. He silenced the phone and returned his attention to Abigail, whose laugh had faded into uncertainty. I have a specially equipped car, Frank said, answering her unspoken question about transportation. My mother used a wheelchair in her later years. Another lie, smooth and practiced. In truth, the vehicle had been modified for transporting injured associates who couldn't go to hospitals. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken questions. Finally, Abigail nodded. Dinner would be nice, she conceded quietly, but I'll need to be home early. Frank wondered what waited for her there. An empty apartment, silence, and $3 that would have bought a miserable excuse for celebration. As Frank helped Mrs. Wilson pack up the remainder of the cake, he slipped her another 100. We were never here, he said quietly. The baker nodded, understanding perfectly the value of discretion. Happy birthday to the young lady, she replied, her eyes darting nervously to Abigail. Outside, Frank's black Suburban waited, engine running, Xavier, his most trusted driver, standing ready to open doors. Abigail hesitated at the sight of the imposing vehicle with its tinted windows. Who are you, really? She asked, snow gathering on her shoulders. Someone who pays his debts, Frank answered simply, as Xavier deployed the wheelchair ramp. What he didn't tell her was that once Frank Carson considered you under his protection, the entire underworld took notice. For better or worse, Abigail Porter's life was about to change forever. The Carson estate stood like a fortress on the outskirts of Boston, sprawling across several acres of pristine landscape. Through the falling snow, Abigail glimpsed stone walls and wrought iron gates that opened automatically as they approached, security cameras tracking their movement. Abigail's stomach tightened with anxiety as Xavier effortlessly transferred her from the car to her wheelchair. The mansion loomed before her, its windows glowing with warm light that somehow failed to make it feel welcoming, instead emphasizing its impenetrable grandeur. We have ramps installed at every entrance, Frank explained, noticing her apprehensive gaze. Mia had already run ahead, shedding coat and boots in a trail behind her, calling for someone named Mrs. Callahan with the comfortable familiarity of home. Inside, the opulence was understated but unmistakable. Hardwood floors, priceless art, and furniture that whispered old money rather than shouted new wealth. Abigail felt increasingly out of place in her second-hand clothes and scuffed wheelchair, a sensation Frank seemed to sense. The piano is in the conservatory, he said, deftly changing the subject away from her discomfort. It belonged to my wife, Claire. She played beautifully. A shadow crossed his face. So brief Abigail almost missed it. Mia has lessons, but her heart isn't in it. Mrs. Callahan appeared, a stern-faced woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun. Her expression softened only when she looked at Mia, who was now excitedly telling her about their new friend Abigail, and the birthday cake they had shared. I've asked Cook to prepare something special, Frank said, guiding Abigail through wide hallways designed to accommodate her wheelchair. Nothing elaborate, just pasta, as Mia mentioned. I hope that's acceptable. The careful politeness felt strange coming from a man who clearly ruled his world. The conservatory took Abigail's breath away, a glass-enclosed space filled with lush plants and dominated by a magnificent grand piano that gleamed in the soft lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the snow falling silently outside, creating a magical backdrop. Play something, please, Mia begged, climbing onto the piano bench and patting the spot beside her. Abigail's fingers ached with longing as she looked at the instrument that represented everything she had lost. Not just mobility, but the life she had planned. I haven't played in 3 years, Abigail admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can anymore. Frank stood silently by the doorway, watching with an intensity that made her both uncomfortable and strangely seen in a way she hadn't been since the accident. Mia's innocent persistence finally wore down Abigail's resistance, and Frank wheeled her to the piano. Her hands hovered uncertainly over the keys, muscle memory battling with fear. When she finally pressed down, producing a simple chord, tears sprang to her eyes. The dinner that followed was surreal. Fine china, crystal glasses, and gourmet pasta served by staff who appeared and disappeared with practiced invisibility. Through it all, Frank observed Abigail with calculated interest, drawing out details of her life with questions that seemed casual but weren't. You must miss practicing physical therapy, he commented as they finished dessert. Abigail nodded, unprepared for the direct acknowledgement of her loss. Every day, she admitted. I miss feeling useful. Frank set down his wine glass with deliberate precision. "I have a proposition for you," he said. "Mia needs a physical therapist who understands children. Our last one quit rather abruptly." Something in his tone suggested the departure hadn't been entirely voluntary. Abigail's instinctive refusal died on her lips as Mia looked at her with hopeful eyes. "Could you teach me piano, too?" the little girl asked, unaware of the tension between the adults. "Daddy says music is good for the soul." 3 weeks later, Abigail had fallen into an unexpected routine. Monday through Friday, Xavier would arrive precisely at 9 to drive her to the Carson estate, where she would spend 4 hours with Mia, combining physical therapy exercises with piano lessons that were healing something in Abigail herself. The generous salary Frank paid was already transforming her life. She had moved to a more accessible apartment in a safer neighborhood, and purchased a motorized wheelchair that gave her unprecedented independence. Yet questions nagged at her constantly about Frank's true business. Small details had begun to accumulate. The armed men who patrolled the grounds, the hushed phone calls that ended when she entered a room, the way local business owners deferred to Frank with a mixture of respect and fear when they encountered him in public with Abigail and Mia. One afternoon, Abigail arrived to find the house in unusual disarray. Security personnel moved with tense purpose, and Mrs. Callahan greeted her with strained cordiality. "Mr. Carson is in his study," she said. "He asks that you take Mia to the East Wing today, and remain there until he comes for you." Mia seemed oblivious to the tension, chattering happily about a dream she'd had involving flying horses as Abigail wheeled them both to the rarely used East Wing. Through a partially open door, Abigail glimpsed Frank in heated conversation with a man whose face was turned away. "The Ravelli family knows about the girl," the stranger was saying. "They think she's your weakness." Frank's response was too low to hear, but his expression was transformative. Gone was the polite businessman, replaced by something cold and lethal that sent chills down Abigail's spine. That evening, Frank came to find them as promised. His composure restored, though a dangerous energy still hummed beneath the surface. "I'd like you to stay here tonight," he said without preamble. "It's not safe for you to return to your apartment." "Not safe?" Abigail repeated, fear climbing her throat. "What does that mean? What have you involved me in?" Mia looked up from her coloring book, sensing the shift in atmosphere, her small face suddenly serious beyond her years. Frank dismissed Mia to find Mrs. Callahan, waiting until she was out of earshot before continuing. "There are people who would hurt those I care about to get to me," he said simply. "They've learned of your connection to this household. What exactly do you do, Frank?" Abigail asked, though she already suspected the answer. Outside, darkness had fallen, and she could see men with guns patrolling the grounds, their breath forming clouds in the cold night air. Frank's silence was answer enough. He moved to the window, his back to her, as he surveyed his property with the vigilance of a man accustomed to threats. "I protect what's mine," he said finally, "by whatever means necessary." "And what am I to you?" Abigail challenged, anger giving her courage. "An employee? A charity case? Someone who saved your daughter once, so now you're repaying the debt?" Her words hung between them, sharp-edged and unavoidable. Frank turned, crossing the room until he stood before her wheelchair, then knelt to bring himself to her eye level, a gesture that struck her as both calculated and genuinely respectful. "You are under my protection now," he said quietly, "whether you want to be or not." That night, unable to sleep in the luxurious guest suite, Abigail wheeled herself to the window overlooking the grounds. In the distance, she saw car headlights approaching the gate, then the flash of gunfire, brief, controlled bursts that were quickly extinguished, leaving only darkness and questions. By morning, there was no evidence of disturbance. The grounds were immaculate, the staff composed, and Frank calmly having breakfast with Mia when Abigail joined them. Only the newspaper headline offered confirmation. "Suspected mob associate found dead near harbor. You need to leave Boston," Frank told Abigail a week later, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I've purchased a house in Vermont, remote and secure. You'll continue working with Mia there." He slid papers across the desk, property deeds, bank accounts, all in her name. Abigail stared at the documents in disbelief, then pushed them back toward him. "I can't accept this," she said firmly. "I won't be owned, Frank. Not even by you." In the month since their paths had crossed in the bakery, something had shifted between them, respect evolving into something deeper, neither had named. Frank's expression hardened, a glimpse of the man others feared. "This isn't a request, Abigail. The Ravelli family has put a price on your head to get to me. 3 of my men died last night protecting your apartment building. His words landed like physical blows, reality crashing down around her. The magnitude of what her life had become crashed over Abigail in waves. She had gone from forgotten and alone with $3 to her name, to the center of a mafia war simply because Frank Carson had bought her a birthday cake. The irony would be laughable if it weren't so terrifying. "What about you?" she asked, the question surprising them both. "Are you coming to Vermont too?" Something vulnerable flickered across Frank's face before he controlled it, reminding her that beneath the dangerous exterior was a man who had suffered losses of his own. "I have business to finish here," he replied. What went unsaid but hung between them was clear. He intended to eliminate the threat permanently, by whatever bloody means necessary. The knowledge should have horrified her more than it did. "I don't want to be responsible for more deaths," Abigail said, her fingers nervously tracing patterns on the wheelchair's armrest. "Not yours, not your men's, not even your enemies." Frank studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Surprise, perhaps, or possibly respect. The safe house was a compromise, a fortified apartment on the outskirts of Boston, where Abigail and Mia would stay with round-the-clock security while Frank dealt with the Ravelli threat. The little girl thought it was an adventure, unaware of the danger that necessitated their relocation. 3 days into their seclusion, Abigail woke to shouting and gunfire. Heart pounding, she transferred herself to the wheelchair and rushed to Mia's room, finding it empty. Panic clawed at her throat as she wheeled frantically through the apartment, calling the child's name. She found Mia huddled in a closet, eyes wide with fear. "They took Mrs. Callahan," the little girl whispered. "The bad men said they're coming back for me." Outside the apartment, the sounds of struggle had stopped, an eerie silence falling that was somehow more frightening than the chaos. Making a split-second decision, Abigail lifted Mia onto her lap and wheeled them both to the service elevator she'd noticed during their arrival. It was meant for deliveries, bypassing the main lobby and exiting through the kitchen service area, potentially unguarded. The night air hit them like a physical shock as they emerged into the alley behind the building. Mia clung to Abigail, her small body trembling. "Where's Daddy?" she asked repeatedly, her voice small and frightened. Abigail had no answers, only determination to keep this child safe. Using strength built from years of maneuvering her wheelchair, Abigail pushed them through back streets, avoiding main roads where they might be spotted. Her arms burned with exertion, her breathing labored, but fear gave her energy she hadn't known she possessed. They found temporary shelter in an all-night diner, where the waitress, seeing their distress, ushered them to a back booth and brought hot chocolate without asking questions. Abigail borrowed the woman's phone, hesitating before dialing the only number she had memorized, Frank's private line. Frank's voice, when he answered, was tight with controlled fury. "Where are you?" he demanded, relief evident beneath the anger. When Abigail told him, he said only, "Stay there. I'm coming," before the line went dead. 20 minutes that felt like eternity passed before the diner's door swung open, admitting not Frank, but Xavier, his normally impassive face marked with a deep cut above his eye. He moved with controlled urgency to their booth, scanning the nearly empty restaurant for threats. "Mr. Carson sent me," he said quietly, helping Abigail transfer Mia back to her lap. "We need to move now." His tone left no room for questions as he efficiently wheeled them to a nondescript van waiting in the alley, its windows tinted against prying eyes. The safe house they reached an hour later was unlike the luxurious apartment they'd fled. A modest cabin nestled in dense woods, its unremarkable exterior belying the sophisticated security systems Xavier activated upon arrival. "Mr. Carson will be here by morning," he informed them, checking his weapons with practiced efficiency. Mia finally fell asleep curled against Abigail's side on the narrow bed, exhaustion overcoming fear. In the dim light, Abigail studied the child's face, struck by how quickly she had come to care for her. Sometimes love arrives in unexpected packages, she thought, smoothing Mia's tangled hair. Dawn was breaking when the sound of approaching vehicles roused them. Xavier positioned himself at the window, weapon ready, then relaxed marginally. "It's the boss," he confirmed, moving to deactivate the alarms. Frank entered like a storm, his pristine suits replaced by tactical gear, blood staining his sleeve where a bullet had grazed him. His eyes found Mia first, relief washing over his features as she ran to him with a cry, then shifted to Abigail with an intensity that stole her breath. "You saved her," he said. The simple statement weighted with emotion he rarely displayed. Behind him, more men filed into the cabin, creating a perimeter of protection around them. Among them stood a man Abigail recognized from the newspaper, Chief Detective Brian Walsh of Boston PD. The detective's presence made no sense in this context until he spoke. The Ravelli warehouse is secure. We found evidence linking them to 3 unsolved homicides and the missing Baker testimony. His tone was professional, but the familiar way he addressed Frank suggested a long-standing arrangement. Your father worked for mine, Frank told Abigail when the detective had stepped outside. William Porter was my father's accountant before the Ravelli family had him killed for refusing to launder their money. The revelation struck Abigail like physical blow. Her father's mysterious death 15 years earlier suddenly cast in new light. Memories cascaded through her mind. Hushed conversations her parents thought she couldn't hear. Unexplained cash that paid for her dance lessons. Her mother's persistent fear after her father's accident. The Porter family history was entwined with the Carsons in ways she had never imagined. The car crash that paralyzed you wasn't an accident, Frank continued, each word careful and measured. Ravelli's men mistook you for a witness who could identify them in another case. The room seemed to tilt around Abigail as the implications sank in. Her wheelchair, her lost career, all collateral damage in a war she hadn't known existed. Mia had fallen asleep again on a cot in the corner, oblivious to the life-altering conversations happening around her. Frank crossed to her, tucking the blanket more securely around her small form, with a tenderness at odds with the blood still drying on his clothes. "Why didn't you tell me?" Abigail asked, struggling to process these revelations. "All this time, you knew who I was, who my father was." The betrayal stung, even as another part of her acknowledged that Frank's world operated on need-to-know information and calculated risks. Frank returned to kneel beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. "I didn't just repay a debt when I found you in that bakery," he said quietly. "I was fulfilling a promise I made to your father before he died, to protect his daughter if the Ravelli family ever found her." Detective Walsh returned, his expression grave. "They're moving tonight. We intercepted communications about hitting the downtown properties. They think you're vulnerable with resources divided." Frank nodded, the mantle of leadership settling visibly over him as he issued rapid-fire orders to his men. 6 months later, Boston had transformed from winter to summer, and with it, the landscape of power throughout the city. The Ravelli family's collapse had been spectacular. Arrests, asset seizures, and a very public trial that dominated headlines for weeks without ever mentioning Frank Carson's name. Abigail sat in the sunroom of the main Carson house, where she now lived permanently as Mia's guardian and tutor, watching the child practice cartwheels on the lawn. The physical therapy had strengthened the girl's coordination immensely, her natural athleticism flourishing under Abigail's guidance. The transition hadn't been easy. Nightmares plagued both Abigail and Mia for weeks after the Ravelli incident. Professional counselors visited the estate regularly, helping them process the trauma with techniques specially adapted for Mia's young mind and Abigail's unique perspective. Local newspapers had run speculation about the mysterious woman now residing at the Carson estate, theories ranging from distant relative to secret lover. Frank had neither confirmed nor denied any rumors, his silence creating a protective bubble around their developing family unit. Abigail had discovered unexpected strength in her new role, advocating fiercely for accessibility improvements throughout Boston's public spaces. Her medical knowledge combined with personal experience made her arguments impossible to dismiss, especially when backed by the Carson name and resources. The piano had become their shared language, a form of communication beyond words, where emotions too complex for speech found expression. Evenings often ended with Abigail playing while Frank listened, his usually guarded expression softening into something vulnerable that only she was privileged to witness. From her wheelchair, Abigail sifted through applications for the Porter Carson Foundation, her brainchild, funded by Frank, but bearing her father's name alongside his. Its mission was providing support to victims of violent crime, especially those with spinal injuries requiring long-term care and rehabilitation. The foundation had given Abigail purpose beyond anything she'd imagined that lonely birthday 6 months earlier. Using her medical background and personal experience, she had created programs that addressed both physical and emotional recovery, filling gaps the healthcare system routinely ignored. Frank entered silently, a habit that once unnerved her, but now felt familiar. His business had shifted dramatically, the illegal operations dismantled or transferred to legitimate enterprises. His influence redirected toward community development projects in South Boston, where he'd grown up poor and hungry. "The renovations are complete," he announced, handing her photographs of a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center downtown, built with foundation funds and staffed by the best therapists in New England. The Porter Wing opens next month. The naming was his idea, a public acknowledgement of her father's sacrifice. Their relationship had evolved cautiously, neither rushing toward definitions or declarations. Frank respected her independence fiercely, never making decisions for her even as he provided resources that expanded her possibilities. For her part, Abigail had stopped flinching at his darker aspects, understanding the complex man beneath. "Mrs. Callahan needs your approval on the gala menu," Frank said, changing subjects with characteristic abruptness. "And Mia wants piano lessons after dinner." The domestic normality of these concerns contrasted sharply with the armed guards still patrolling the perimeter of the property. Some threats remained, though diminished. Frank's legitimate businesses flourished, his political connections deepened, and rumors persisted that he might eventually run for mayor, a development that would have seemed ludicrous a year ago, but now felt strangely plausible. Xavier appeared in the doorway with a familiar box from Wilson's bakery. "Mrs. Wilson sends her regards," he said, placing the package on the table. Inside was an elegant chocolate cake, identical to the one Frank had bought for Abigail on that snowy day that changed everything. "It's tradition now," Frank explained with a rare smile. "Every month on your birthday date, we celebrate another month of our strange family." Mia had spotted the cake and came running, her face lighting up at the continuation of what had become her favorite ritual. Later, as they shared the cake, Abigail reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The lonely woman with $3 for her birthday cake now directed a multi-million-dollar foundation, lived in a mansion with round-the-clock security, and had found family in the most unexpected places. "I have something to show you," Frank said after Mia had gone to bed. He guided Abigail's wheelchair to a room she'd never entered before, his private study. On the wall hung a single photograph, William Porter with a much younger Frank, both smiling, arms around each other's shoulders. "He saved my life once," Frank said quietly. "I was 17, stupid, running with the wrong crowd. He pulled me out, convinced my father I was worth a second chance." The admission cost him visibly, this glimpse into the vulnerable past of a man who had built his life on projecting strength. Abigail reached for his hand, bridging the final distance between them. "We save each other," she said simply. "That's what family does." Frank knelt beside her wheelchair, his customary position when they spoke of important matters, bringing himself to her eye level in a gesture of equality she had come to treasure. 1 year to the day after their first meeting in Wilson's bakery, Frank and Abigail stood, he literally, she in her wheelchair, before a ribbon stretched across the entrance of the newest Porter Carson Foundation building. This facility, unlike the others, wasn't a rehabilitation center, but a community arts space in South Boston. "Music saved me when I thought I had nothing left," Abigail told the gathered crowd, her confidence as a public speaker growing with each event. "Now we want to offer that same healing to others." Behind her, Frank stood with Mia, the little girl beaming with pride at the woman she had come to call Mom. Detective Walsh, now Commissioner Walsh thanks to his successful prosecution of the Ravelli family, nodded respectfully to Frank from across the crowd. Their unusual alliance had transformed Boston's crime landscape, channeling power and resources toward rebuilding neglected neighborhoods. The centerpiece of the new building was a recital hall featuring 12 pianos, 1 for the instructor and 11 for students who couldn't afford lessons elsewhere. Mia would be among the first volunteer student teachers, sharing her growing skill with other children while building community connections that transcended socioeconomic boundaries. Mrs. Wilson had catered the event, her small bakery having expanded into a successful business with Frank's investment. She still personally baked the chocolate cake that had become the signature dessert at all foundation events, a sweet reminder of beginnings that had seemed inauspicious but proved transformative. Abigail's physical condition hadn't changed. Her paralysis remained permanent according to every specialist they'd consulted, yet her life had expanded in ways she could never have imagined, filled with purpose, love, and impact that reached far beyond her wheelchair's limitations. Frank had proposed 3 months earlier, on her 25th birthday. The ring he offered wasn't a diamond, but a piano key mounted in platinum, symbolizing the music she had reclaimed, and the harmony they had found together despite their unlikely beginnings. The wedding was planned for winter, a deliberate choice to commemorate the season of their meeting. Mia would be flower girl, Xavier best man, and Mrs. Callahan had already begun planning a celebration that would bring together Boston's elite alongside residents from the Foundation's programs. "Cut the ribbon," Frank urged now, his hand warm on Abigail's shoulder. She nodded, guiding her wheelchair forward as cameras flashed. capturing the moment for tomorrow's papers. The oversized scissors were awkward in her hands, but she managed the cut with practiced grace. Inside, children from the neighborhood waited excitedly for their first glimpse of the facility that would become their artistic home. Many came from families that had once feared the Carson name, now beneficiaries of its redefined legacy through scholarship programs and community investment. Former rivals who had survived the power shift approached Frank cautiously at these public events, offering allegiance in exchange for inclusion in the new order. Abigail watched these interactions with newfound understanding, recognizing the delicate diplomacy required to maintain peace without weakness. The Foundation's board included respected medical professionals, alongside reformed criminals, who had valuable perspective on systemic issues. This unconventional mix sometimes created tension at meetings, but produced innovative solutions that traditional approaches had missed for decades. Mia had blossomed into the role of unofficial ambassador, her natural charm bridging divides between communities that had been separated by fear and prejudice. Her school friends now included children from all backgrounds, their playdates carefully supervised but genuinely joyful. Rehabilitation specialists from around the country had begun applying for positions with the Foundation, drawn by its holistic approach and generous funding. Abigail personally interviewed each applicant, ensuring they understood that compassion was as important as technical expertise in their methodology. Every piano in the recital hall had been dedicated to a victim of violence in Boston, their names engraved on small plaques, their stories preserved in a memorial book. Abigail's idea, implemented with Frank's resources, ensuring that healing grew from remembrance rather than vengeance. The security team remained, though less visible now. Frank Carson had too many enemies in his past to ever truly let down his guard, but their presence had become a reassurance rather than a reminder of danger, a protective circle around the unconventional family that had formed from tragedy. Mia rushed to the main piano, eager to demonstrate her progress to the gathered guests. As her small fingers moved confidently across the keys, Abigail felt Frank's hand find hers, squeezing gently in shared pride and something deeper, gratitude for the unexpected paths that had brought them here. $3, Frank whispered, referring to the amount she'd had for her cake that fateful day. Abigail smiled, understanding the shorthand they'd developed. From the smallest beginnings, $3, a chance encounter, a simple act of kindness, had grown a foundation, a family, a future. Local business owners who once paid protection money now served on community advisory boards. Their relationships with the Carson family transformed from fear to partnership. The transition hadn't been seamless. Old habits died hard on both sides, but the mutual benefits had proven worth the struggle. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support is what keeps me creating these stories for you.